On today's show.
When I was 16 years old, I wasn't trying to decide if I should go to karate camp or astronaut school. I was trying to decide how I'm going to keep from getting robbed, how I'm going to keep the police from harassing me, to help my mom put food on the table with no skills, no education. It seems very attractive to say, well, I just stand in this building and sell like this packet all day or whatever, and like walk out of here with $500 at the end of the day. And then I'm telling my mother, look, Mom, look what I found. And to see the happiness in her face. First thing that I realized being incarcerated was that there's no one protecting you inside from anyone. It's a real scary and dark place that you begin to wonder, wow, if something happens to me in here, like who would know? Education and the access to education, whether it's presented to you by the institution or you bury your head in the law library or in the general library like I did, you start to see opportunities where before you saw nothing but challenges.
Hello and welcome to Beyond the Box, the social justice podcast that goes beyond the headlines and typical stories. We like to ask challenging and incisive questions to help us get to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of important issues. I'm your co-host, Doug Lasdon, founder and executive director of the Urban Justice Center. I am thrilled today to have Johnny Perez as my guest. I have been so impressed by Johnny's intelligence and wisdom that I invited him to join me as a co-host for this season's podcast. Johnny is currently the director of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture's U.S. prison program. He is a highly accomplished criminal justice advocate, public speaker, and thought leader. He also happens to be an excellent photographer and writer. Welcome, Johnny.
Thanks for having me, Doug. So glad to be here.
It's always great to sit across from you and talk to you. Let's just start in sort of not the beginning of your life, but the beginning of your adventure. That is a euphemism if I've ever used one, but you landed yourself in jail. Tell us how that happened. Tell us where you were, what you were doing, and okay.
I'll give you some background, and actually sitting here, I was just telling you, like, feels nostalgic. The last time I was sitting here, I was helping a client face reentry challenges, some of the same ones that I faced myself before coming to the Urban Justice Center so many years ago. During my teenage years is really when I started to get into trouble a lot. And what did that look like for me? I grew up in the Bronx. I was born in Cuba from Cuban descent. My mother raised me and three of my brothers. So I'm the
What
oldest
age
of
were you
four.
when you came over?
When I came from Cuba, I was 10 months old.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then throughout the years, we landed in New York City. And in fact, we wasn't even supposed to land in New York City. We were going from Connecticut to Miami, and someone stole all of our luggage in 42nd Street. We ended up here in the shelter at 42nd Street, in fact.
Yeah.
So that's how we landed here in New York. But for about the age of like 13, 14, my mother took on a number of jobs, and me and my brothers were left unsupervised, and I ended up making friends and eventually ended up running the streets.
Would you call that the wrong friends or just friends?
Yeah, I think that was just people in the community.
You were just being a kid.
Yeah, for sure. 13, 14 years old, new in New York, don't know anyone, and just making friends and kind of trying to fit in, et cetera, and doing a number of things, including leaving in the middle of the night while my mother's working. Ultimately, though, I think around the age of 16, that's when we started living in the Bronx. And while there, basically started selling drugs. And that came from two things. I think one, being tempted to do so. I think, on the way to home every day, people are literally outside, selling drugs, buying and selling almost anything, right? And then eventually, the pressure that my mom was facing, my mother by herself, 4 kids, I'm the oldest of 4, working 2 jobs, one of which was a home health aide and the other one was a cashier at McDonald's, and still we couldn't make ends meet. And although that wasn't the reason that I started, I think, applying criminal problems to our solutions, but poverty was a real thing growing up for us. We were very food insecure.
You and everybody around you, I imagine.
Yeah, for sure.
That's the neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely. Eventually I ended up getting incarcerated for the first time for, selling drugs.
When you came out, were you scared straight, or were you, hey, I'm out, I'm going to be me?
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to my friends? Or
Yeah, good question. At first, no. When I first started getting arrested for drugs, I didn't have a record, so they would literally let me out. But being in the bookings for the first time as a teenager was very scary. There's a few things here. So there's one, this ideology, that came with getting arrested and going to Rikers Island and surviving and coming out, which also didn't serve as a deterrent.
Did it sort of throw you a little more into the criminal side of things?
Where eventually I would get arrested at 16 for gun possession. And in that charge, I ended up doing 10 months on Rikers Island for that charge as a juvenile. I got youth offender status and all that, but I ended up doing a year on Rikers Island, 60 of those days in solitary. That was an opportunity where I did come home saying, well, I definitely don't want to go back to Rikers Island ever again. Okay. And now I'm 17 now.
It didn't work.
Yeah.
Didn't stick.
Well, no, it didn't work because sometimes we address the problem, but fail to address the exact cause of the problem. So what eventually led me to selling drugs was still there, poverty, need, lack of opportunity,
friends,
lack of examples.
Fitting into the culture
and going back into the same community where people were doing exactly the same thing, whether there were crimes of survival or crimes of however you want to categorize them, that, there were still people in our community addressing their problems with criminal activity and criminal solutions. So much so that even law enforcement, I can't tell you the number of times when I've been pulled over and if I didn't have a receipt or I didn't have a pay stub, the amount of money that I have in my pocket would be taken from me, if you will. So eventually, I got arrested for robbery. I ended up sticking somebody up or robbing somebody who was also selling drugs, but it doesn't matter what they were doing. Robbery is still robbery. And
you were like that. What's the character on The Wire? You were robbing the drug dealers.
Yeah, there's the activity and there's the ideology, right? Well, at 21 years old, you think you have all the answers, but you're asking all the wrong questions. Well, if I rob somebody else who's selling drugs, like what can possibly happen? And then that's how you end up in so many ways doing 13 years in prison out of a 15-year sentence from the age of 21 to the age of 34. I definitely had choice in my community. And throughout years, I reflected on the choices that were presented to me in the first place. Like when I was 16 years old, I wasn't trying to decide if I should go to karate camp or astronaut school. I was trying to decide, how I'm going to keep from getting robbed, how I'm going to keep the police from harassing me, how I'm going to keep to help my mom put food on the table with no skills, no education. It seems very attractive to say, well, I just stand in this building and sell like this packet all day or whatever and like walk out of here with $500 at the end of the day. And then I'm telling my mother, look, Mom, look what I found. And to see the happiness in her face and to see my brothers and sisters eat.
You told her this is what I found and she bought it?
Yeah, but not long.
Yeah.
Not long, because after that, I ended up moving out and I really kind of just like ended up being in the street kind of like full time, which ultimately had consequences not only on my life, but also like my siblings. And I say this now. I'm 46 years old today.
Let's move forward a little bit.
Yeah.
So you were in for 13 years, and tell us in a second how much of that was in solitary. And this I don't know if this is too general of a question, but what was it like? What comes to mind to let us know?
I think the most shocking first thing that I realized being incarcerated was that there's no one protecting you inside from anyone.
Not the guards, in other words.
No, definitely not the correction officers and even not the folks that are there. It's like it's a real scary and dark place that you begin to wonder, wow, if something happens to me in here, like who would know? One of the first letters I wrote to my mother was, Mom, if you don't hear from me at least once a month, because I get like 6 stamps a month. If you don't hear from me at least once a month, please call the prison. Because I learned really early on that when the institution knows that you have family on the outside, you get treated a little bit differently. I mean, that may mean that you may just get beat up less, but you're still, subject to the environment. Second, the reality that everything that like I knew in society now is different in here. I can't freely trust in here. There's no currency. There's no women. I don't know exactly when I'm leaving. And then there's this unwritten culture about, relationships, with this gang affiliations. Even if you're not affiliated, just being from a neighborhood, that automatically comes you in.
Can you get yourself affiliated?
Yeah, I mean, many people do for protection.
Did you?
I couldn't because I could not understand a few things. I already knew that if I became affiliated with any organization, even religion, how's that? And now putting myself in a position where I have to, one, be with a certain group, and then whatever that group issues are now become my issues. And although 13 years sounds like a long time at 21 years old, I was around people who had 50 to life. Yeah. In Kaksaki Correctional Facility, I was sitting across a 19-year-old who got 50 to life. And he's talking about when he's going to get home. And I'm like, brother, when you get home, you're going to be 68 years old. Yeah. Like, forget about that, So it gave me perspective about my 13 years. And I'm like, well, if you have to sit here for 13 years, then what do you do? And how do you now turn this situation into something that you can actually capitalize off of.
And how did you do that?
So I created a list. I appreciate that. You're such a kid. That's how you do that. Well, one, I had to have a change in perspective. And one book, that I think really resonated with me was a book titled A Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Okay. And in the book, he talks about how, he was in a situation that had uncontrollable circumstances around him, but the only thing he could control was himself and how he reacted to circumstances. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, I can't control the fact that I'm here. Like, I can't get out. I can't do this. I can't do that. But what can I do with myself? And I started to look at the environment as more of an opportunity to learn from the people that were there, to read, to do a number of things. Now, what I set out to do, it was a long list, but what I ended up doing was that I did end up getting a college degree while I was incarcerated. I ended up definitely writing a number of things. I ended up facilitating a number of classes across a number of different issues.
Let me just say, that is wonderful. Are they, I believe they're cutting back those programs?
Yes.
That's so sad.
Yeah. And through all of that, I built some really amazing relationships with some amazing people. And it deepened my understanding not only of society, but also like, how did I get here? Yeah. And at times that I thought I had an option where it wasn't really an option. I was choosing from a predetermined set of options, like my economics professor, Dr. Shari from Siena College used to always say. And then from there, through that education and the access to education, whether it's presented to you by the institution or you bury your head in the law library or in the general library like I did, you start to see opportunities where before you saw nothing but challenges. And when I came home.
Isn't that great? Good
yeah.
Yeah.
And there's more there, but.
I was wanted to ask a question, an odd question for somebody who was in jail or prison. And, what was the best thing that about prison? And
so here's the sort of nuanced answer, and if you would have asked me years ago, I would have said education and time. Mm-hmm. But now I'll say education and time, except that I didn't have to go to prison to get education and have time. So what that means is that the best thing that happened to me while I was incarcerated was education and access to higher education. That gave me a number of different tools and resources, much of which I use today, except that I would argue that to have to discover education in a prison setting begs a bigger question, whether it was the prison or was it education. And in this case...
That's an interesting nuance. In other words, what you're saying, are you saying that you didn't really have that opportunity when you were out living in the Bronx where you were living?
In so many ways, no. I was able to access private college while incarcerated.
Yeah.
And then I also had access to being able to attend college in a safe, arguably like in a safe environment where I was able to really engage the professor, like a number of things that when you look at the community that I came from and grew up in, it's like a dream to go to a place like that. So it's like the question now becomes like, why? But it wasn't not only just my experience, but that was the common denominator amongst a lot of my peers. And I went to 9 different prisons over 13 years. 5 of those were in prisons where I was doing some type of college programming.
Great.
Yeah.
The worst thing about it? The worst thing about prison?
The dehumanization. Yeah. Being away from family, having my family subjected to all types of inhumane treatment just to see me. There's that. And then, being in solitary. I did a total of 3 years in solitary, with the longest time being 10 months for smoking pot. Which is legal today in many states,
But not in prison, probably.
Yeah, not in prison, right? In a highly stressful environment where you imagine people trying to cope with a new reality.
Where the pot would help.
Yeah, we criminalize public health issues much in the same way that we do in society, which years later I would end up appreciating the work that the Urban Justice Center is doing and continues to do. But the worst thing really was the dehumanization across the board. The dehumanization in its culture, whether I'm, stripped down and my hair is shaved from day one, to the dehumanization that stretches to my family. Right now there's prisons that, send letters to other states and you don't even get the letter that your kid wrote. You get a picture of the letter, and it's at that level. I remember my mother, rubbing her hand through the visiting gates because there was no human contact. You couldn't hug your family. That's the worst part. That actually perpetuates a lot of the behavior that I would argue the institution is trying to address in the first place, at least in writing or in value or in idea and spirit. Yeah.
You haven't said the guards.
Yeah, the correction officers. I met some good correction officers upstate who risked their lives. Good. I mean, not their lives, their jobs. I've had correction officers.
You mean to be more humane?
Yeah. Whether to bring me in a burger.
Oh, nice.
You know, and like, hey, there's a bag over there, and if you grab it, I didn't see it. That kind of thing, you know?
The bag had burgers in it?
Yeah, burgers or deer meat. In fact, the first time I ever ate was upstate. And then the opposite has also been true, where being on the receiving end of the abuse. You know, I remember Officer Rollage in Bay Hill Correctional Facility, you know, he made me shovel a pile of snow that is like, I'm 6 feet tall, but it's like 3 times taller than me, from one end of the yard to the other end of the yard, just because I was the lucky winner that day. And he would literally just pick people at randomly and take your ID.
Sadistic.
Yeah, I mean, eventually this particular incident, he was investigated, went to his house, they found about 100 IDs from incarcerated people that he just had in his backyard using for target practice. It was some other stuff.
Yeah. Let me ask you another question. You got 13 years. That's a long time. You know that better than anyone. Yeah. You know, and it's often occurred to me that our sentences are just too long. The other argument is that, well, if we make it shorter, then we lose some of the motivation so that people will be more law-abiding. And if we make them shorter, society is going to be more dangerous.
Yeah.
Can you talk to that? And
I would say
your own length. Was it too long? Was it just about right? Or given what you did? Or
I'm going to give you 2 anecdotes. One, you know, in my own experience, I would say that I like so-called got the message like year 5.
Oh, really? Okay.
I think like year 5. Because look, you know.
And was that after you had some college and.
Yeah, let's be honest, right? If I'm running the streets, right, and I'm creating harm in the streets for whatever reason, it doesn't necessarily stop overnight when you're incarcerated. So I'll be honest and say that for the first 2 to 3 years, I wasn't the best behaved person while I was incarcerated, on top of the fact that I'm trying to adapt to this new reality. However, around year 5, it's like, hey, if there were any doubt that I would come home and apply criminal solutions to any problems that I would have, it was literally gone. Because now I'm starting to think about what am I going to do when I come home, because I have to do something legal. I have to find a job, et cetera, et cetera. And that was a catalyst that opened up a lot of other things and even the type of.
Do you think most people come to that realization, or were you somehow different? Or
no, well, I'm giving you that response, and it's a very kind of like narrow individual piece.
I know you're a special person, but in terms of this issue, are you special, or do you think that is, do you think from looking around that most people, maybe with a few more years, a few years away from society, they come to the realization with, I don't want to come back. Yeah. And this is what I got to do?
Well, time doesn't equal changing in behavior. The length of time is not proportionate to the amount of change you'll make. Because I've met people inside, they've only done a year, have never come back. And I've known folks who out of 13 years, I can tell you, I met people who did 5 years and came back and did 3, went home and came back for, you know, like, wow, I've seen you go home 3 times in the last 13 years.
And they come back and you say, you know, what's going on here?
So there's like, there's a bigger question there beyond time and thinking that time equates.
What do you think the difference might be? I think and then I'll let you finish your explanation. But
no, I think it's a number of factors. One major thing that made me look at my own behavior was a restorative justice program, where I said, wow, I sat across somebody who was robbed, and I had a crime robbery where I robbed someone, and really came face to face with the issue to the point where it made me question my values. And when I questioned my values, that then equated change. That doesn't equal to time. The system, the way
it might
that
not
is
be
set
irrelevant
up,
to time.
No, but the system that we have takes the power away from both parties, in this case, the perpetrator and the person on the receiving end, because when you ask crime victims, what do they want to feel safe? If the goal of the institution is to keep society safe, we have to talk to the crime victims and say, well, what will make you feel safe? Like Johnny just robbed you. What will help you feel safe? And when you ask crime victims, folks have been written about it. I'll highlight the work of Danielle Surratt, Until We Reckon, where she interviewed crime victims, and she found that most crime victims actually want, you know, if it's a property crime, they want their property back, right? They want an honest and sincere apology. They want to guarantee that it won't happen again, and that doesn't mean incarceration. And it's interesting because our system doesn't ask crime victims, what do you want to see happen, so we can enforce what you want to see happen. We have this retaliative, punitive kind of like system. A, and then B, addressing the root cause of whatever the issue is in the first place. If there's somebody out here robbing folks because they are food insecure, maybe how to really help this person is to address that, which is the root cause of the behavior.
Sure.
And our society just doesn't do that. You know, I had a client, you know, in my former role, in fact, as a safe reentry advocate here at the Urban Justice Center for the Mental Health Project, I had a client who was released in the winter. He was arrested in the summertime, released in the winter, no coat, nothing, homeless, food insecure, etc. And he went and stole a sweater from Ross to stay warm. Immediately, he was back in Rikers Island for theft. No one asked the question, why was this person released without a coat in the middle of winter? Yes, there's culpability, but there's also bigger questions about how society drives these behaviors, both at the individual level and at the societal level, too.
Okay, I want to move on a little bit.
Yeah.
Before prison, during prison, and now let's talk about after prison. And you've mentioned a couple of times, and I'm very proud that you came here to work at the Urban Justice Center.
Oh, yeah, if it wasn't for the Urban Justice Center, I'd tell you.
and I got a chance to meet you, and I will say that, at that point, I think we had over 200 people here, and Johnny stood out. I remember our first conversations, and I was saying, oh, this guy's something special. And and then I sought you out more, and you ended up joining our board of directors, and now we're co-hosts.
That's been an honor.
For me as well. But that didn't happen right away. And
indeed, no?
Talk a little
That's
bit
over
about
12 years. I've been home for 12 years now.
Yeah, and not back. You're definitely a non-recidivist because you don't have trouble putting food on the plate, and you have a real job, and you have so much to stay out for. What's it like? You walk out, they give you your freedom, and tell me what it's like.
Yeah, so I'll say it on two levels. The hardest part about just reintegrating back into society at the basics, housing, employment, of course, to feed yourself, and then it's like, how do I now learn to live with a family who has learned to live, without me in so many ways? I went on about 40
So you went back to your mother and your
So I came home, okay. I went directly, back to my mother's house,
it's
which
good
was
you
a little
had
bit
that.
different.
It's good you had that. Not everybody has it.
And she had to get rid of the family dog, actually, because parole would not allow her to have a dog. She had a Rottweiler. And they said,
any dog or a Rottweiler?
They had
dog?
a specific list of dogs: pit bulls, Rottweilers. They have, she had a poodle.
I was going to say you have a poodle or a golden retriever.
So that, even before I even came home, my release was already impacting my family. Stood in the living room for about 6 months while I looked for work, and within those 6 months, I did almost everything. From taking things off Craigslist to
taking in, like
running gigs on Craigslist, like delivery jobs, messenger jobs, daily work, daily pay, picking up trash at the park, etc. And then eventually applied for a job here after a lot of networking too, but applied for a job, at the Urban Justice Center. But I'm gonna pull back a little bit. Before that was that I went on at least 40 job interviews. Yeah. My first suit came from an organization called Midnight Run, where you have to wake up in the middle of the night and meet this org in the middle, in the middle of 42nd Street and, get a secondhand suit, which fit me very well. And that's what I wore to interviews and things like that.
I'm sorry. Oh, Midnight Run is the place giving out clothing for, okay.
Yeah. Because it's things that people don't think about. There's the interview, but do you have attire for the interview? Can you look like you can actually do the job? How do you learn to travel in the city again? The architecture was different for me. My junior high school, now had like a park next to it, and you think that the building was demolished, or you think that you're lost, and just the architecture of the city is different. Learning, especially technology, the phones. My daughter had to teach me how to use the phone, touch screens and all that, and then again, more importantly, my daughter was 2 days old when I got arrested and 13 years old when I got released. So I had to learn to be a father. There had to be a lot of adaptation there again to this question about how does one learn to live with a family that's learned to live without them.
Yeah.
And pick the pieces back up little by little.
Can you talk a little more about the 40 job interviews, how hard it was to get somebody to hire you and trust you? Yeah,
well, one, there's a huge gap in my resume. So there's the question about, what happened between these years. And although I did a lot of, facilitation jobs and jobs that, society would pay me for, I was a law clerk for years inside. Many jobs didn't value that. I didn't even see it as a real job. It's the equivalent of firefighters in California who are incarcerated and fight fires as incarcerated people. But when they come home, they can't get actual jobs as a firefighter. So I'm applying for jobs as a facilitator, teaching anger management, counseling, substance abuse. And none of these jobs were literally take me.
Would they interview you out of those?
I would get it.
Did you really have 40 interviews?
I would have, yes. I would definitely get interviews, but I would not always be the best candidate, or it would be someone who's more qualified, who has their college degree, who did a lot of the legwork as well.
How much of it was not trusting you because you had been in prison?
It's hard to say.
It's hard to say, right? People don't say we're not doing it.
Because that is never the response. I know the response that I've always gotten overwhelmingly is There are people who are more qualified. There's folks who have more experience or have more like official certifications. The Department of Labor certification that I got while I was incarcerated.
Right.
At one point, I leveraged my direct experience with why I should be hired. And I don't know if I got more aggressive because I started to see it as value, or got more aggressive because I was just frustrated with employers saying I'm unqualified. And I'm like, this is the population that I work with while I was incarcerated, if anything.
Yeah. You have great inner resources. Mm-hmm. And so you plugged away and made your way through 40 interviews and finally got yourself a job. How is it do you have, friends who are in with you, and do sometimes they get frustrated and give up, or?
What was my biggest challenge today? Having people that I was incarcerated with, who I used to invite to the law library, invite to the general library, invite to like all of the things, like invite to sign up for the college program, who now literally can't get jobs. And I imagine are having even a harder problem than me for when I came home, and I had those things.
Let me just put it in a positive way for you. You're an extraordinary person. And as an extraordinary person, you made it through this difficult gauntlet to rejoin society with a job that pays you enough to eat and get an apartment and buy clothing and do everything you need to do. Mm-hmm. How hard are we making it for the people who are not extraordinary, do not have extraordinary inner resources?
Very hard. And I'll add not only the internal resources, but also I was able to take advantage of the opportunities too that were presented to me.
Yeah.
So,
but that's part of your that's part of your inner makeup. You were able to do that, and you did have a natural motivation, and you got off course at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, it's discouraging, like inside, you're forced to work for 7 cents an hour. So when you come home, you're not you don't have the greatest morale around plugging away at a job,
right.
So there's that. There's a self-esteem issue when you come home too.
Sure.
Am I even worthy? There's imposter syndrome. The first time I literally wore a blazer, I was like 34 years old. And I'm like, wow, this after years of wearing a uniform and looking like 1,000 people around me.
That might be why you always look very sharp. And I'm impressed. Every time you walk in, I do a double take. Oh, he looks pretty good.
It's like, what can you wear now that you can wear whatever you want, right? And how does that impact your confidence or even the type of things that you feel you even capable of doing? And a lot of our people are released without the confidence to even apply for a job. Like they come out really psychologically and spiritually like beat up. A lot of my work is really encouraging people to tap into like their inner strength and say, hey, that you're worthy of this. That you can do this, right? And like that kind of thing,
So before we go, I want to make sure we have time to talk about your current work.
Yeah,
so before you went in, when you were in, when you got out, but now you have risen to, you are directing a national program, and tell us about that. Tell us why it's important and what you're doing with it. And maybe too many questions all at once. How other people can get involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I know what it is, and it's definitely worthwhile.
Yeah. Well, after working here of, years of direct service with a caseload of people facing a number of different issues, I realized that there's a lot of work happening, that keeps people from going in and keeping people from going in the first place from prison and keeping people from going back to prison. And just as a whole movement, there's things that are happening there now while incarcerated, that really is harmful. And this is just, number of deaths and suicides, et cetera. And as a person that spent time in solitary, I said, I would love to focus my energies on this issue of solitary confinement and conditional confinement and the people that are there now.
Yeah, it's torture. I have no doubt in my mind. What I've read about, what I've talked to, what I see is the really awful, tragic statistics. And maybe tell us a little bit about it. But I'm sorry, I'm taking over a little bit. But as a society, we should not allow it. And we have politicians that know what's going on and they just approve it. And to me, they should not be elected representatives anymore. And our current mayor is one of them, Mayor Adams.
Yeah, absolutely. It's torture in so many different ways, and across the country, we have about 100,000 or so people who are locked inside of a cell, and continue to be, and in some cases even more because there's, entire facility-wide lockdowns that keep people locked in their cells. These are cells the size of your bathroom. I'm 6 feet tall, and if I stretch both of my hands out, I can touch both walls of an average cell, the size of a parking lot. 23 hours a day, locked in there, little to no human contact. Many people don't even have access to their lawyers or even access to the courts. Here in New York, we were lucky enough, with the partnership of a number of different people to pass the Halt Solitary Confinement Act, which severely literally ended this torture of solitary confinement. Yes, but
until the mayor withdrew
exactly.
it.
Yeah, and
I think illegally. But just to add before we go on, there's terrible statistics about suicide and psychological harm.
Yeah, 50% of all suicides, about half of all suicides that happen in a institutional incarceration setting happen in solitary confinement.
Very high also amongst the mentally ill.
Yeah, absolutely. It exasperates, mental health concerns, creates some where there are any. And after years of being inside of these spaces, a lot of people don't know, people are released directly from solitary confinement directly into society. So today, as the director of U.S. prison programs for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, I organize solitary survivors like myself and faith leaders around legislative action around ending the torture of solitary confinement. And we do this not only here in New York State and in New York City, but also across 27 states that are all looking to advance the Mandela rules or the rules around international human rights protections for people
The
who are
Mandela rules are rules that limit solitary confinement to only certain circumstances.
Which the United States has, consistently and grotesquely violated and continues to violate. So we have federal work that we do. We have a federal bill, End the Solitary Confinement Act, which does the same thing that, the leaders and the advocates here, mainly the Jails Action Coalition and the Halt Solitary campaign here in New York City, did at Rikers Island, which was to limit this torture to just 4 hours. Despite the fact that the mayor vetoed the bill, city council, stood on the side of the community and overrode that veto. Except that now we still face newer challenges as we always do with trying to make actual changes and real changes.
Does this take you around the country?
Yeah, it's definitely taken me. I'll tell you, one of the rewards of this work is that I've begun to understand this work beyond my own personal experience. And in 12 years, I've traveled to 27 states. And it hasn't just been at the airport or at the board meeting. I'm like literally in the community with people. I've gone to cookouts. I've gone to rallies and marches. I've testified in a number of capitals around the country.
Great.
Yeah, and just like really honored.
Do you still have your mother? Is your mother still alive?
Yes, she's in Virginia.
Is she proud of you?
Yes.
She must be.
Yeah.
She must be. Look what you've done.
Yeah. In fact, she reminded me the very first talk that I did, in fact, here in my role when I first started working here as a safe reentry advocate was the Criminal Justice Conference at John Jay. And I was interviewed. And she was there for the first time. And then very recently, I was at South by Southwest talking to about a group of about 800 advertisers.
Oh, great.
Talking about the responsibility in advertising. And she was nostalgic about it. But the biggest reward is to see her smile, after years of crying, of seeing me handcuffed and all that. And very proud. And so.
Well, Johnny Perez, I'm so thrilled again to have you take your time. And look, where people should come back. We've recorded a couple already, and we're going to record some more. We're going to do it together. Now people have a little bit of a better idea of where you're coming from, and will be hopefully a little more interested in
I can't wait to kind of co-interview some of our guests, and get their take on some of these issues that, that where they kind of reflective of a lot of the conversations we had. So thanks again.
Where can people go to look to your current work? Is there a website? Or,
yes, absolutely. People can go to...
And a place to donate.
Yes, people can definitely go to www.nrcat.org.
nrcat.org.
Yes. And there you'll definitely find all of our work and different ways to donate. Thank you. We need all the help we can get.
Great. Thank you very much, Johnny.
Thank you.
We're trying to get the word out about the podcast, so if you like it, please make sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app, and please rate us 5 stars on the Apple Podcast. And finally, please pass this episode on to your friends. Thank you for your support.